and this was the slogan at the demonstration, was connecting these two issues. And this was making the point that there is no possible way to understand US policy towards Israel and Palestine without understanding it in its broader context of US strategy towards the entire region. That the desire to crush the resistance of the Palestinian people was part of a coordinated regional strategy to do what the Bush administration called at the outset of his presidency, which is creating a new Middle East, as they called it. And that new Middle East meant that was turning this, what had long been a bastion of anti-imperialism and anti-colonial sentiments, into a new base of American interest. And that for the United States to conquer and dominate Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Lebanon and Sudan and all of the countries that were in the crosshairs, as well as Iran, all of these independent countries that was not within the grip of US imperialism, it set out to do so, and crushing the will of the Palestinian people was an integral part of that plan. So we can't talk about Palestine without talking about the broader aims of dominating not just Palestine, but the other resource-rich countries in the region. Now, we know that in Israel they are celebrating their Independence Day this past weekend, a day of celebration for some, but a commemoration of a violent racist expulsion of over 750,000 indigenous people, the murder of thousands that continued till this day. It is continuing till this day, where every single day settlements expand, settlements that are recognized even by the international community, even by these real client states of US imperialism, as illegal settlements. And, you know, we can't really question the nature of the occupation of Palestine and the nature of the state of Israel. Israel is a colonial project. And as I said earlier, you know, this equal sign between Judaism and Zionism being completely false. I mean, the founders of the Zionist movement, Zionism is a political ideology, right? It is not a religion. And it has used Judaism, it has used the Holocaust to justify some of the worst crimes against another people. Now, Israel is an apartheid state, right? It's a colonial project that was established with the support of European powers, admittedly to be what they called a watchdog for the West, a kind of base of European and now American interests in a very strategic, very resource-rich region of the world. Now, people living in Palestine and occupied territories, of course, are living under a military occupation, but people living within the borders of Israel, Israel has an apartheid government. And even establishment politicians like Jimmy Carter argues that this is apartheid, where you pass a law that says that Arabs cannot buy land, cannot buy homes, cannot drive on certain roads, right? This is racism. These are racist laws. And, you know, this isn't the first time that we've seen this sort of government. This isn't the first time we've seen apartheid. We saw it in South Africa. And in fact, many of the leaders in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa have traveled to Palestine, have traveled to the Israeli settler state, and have said themselves that the apartheid here is far worse and far more racist than the apartheid experience in South Africa. But what happened is apartheid was smashed in South Africa by the heroic resistance of those people in that country, but also the solidarity actions and the heroic people fighting all around the world that made it impossible for that government to continue and for the US government to continue sponsoring it. And so those who think that the foundations of the settler state and this apartheid government are unshakable, that is invincible, we just need to look back in history just a few decades to see that the people do have the power to smash these racist systems and to win true justice for the people who are being occupied. I want to leave some time for discussion, so I hope to cover a few more points first. But I think, these illegal settlements and the expulsion of the Palestinian people over 60 years ago, and the murder and the torture and the illegal imprisonment and the destruction of homes, right, is justified by saying that God gave us this land, is what the Zionists say, right? That we have a right to this land that people have lived on for thousands of years. We have the right to drag them from their homes, bulldoze their houses, and send them to refugee camps. We have the right to bomb their cities, to shoot them with impunity, because it's written in the sacred text, right? Which is funny because it's those same people who accuse those resisting and accuse those in solidarity with them here of religious extremism, right? Well, who's the religious extremist in this situation? Now, I think much was revealed with the leaking of the Palestine Papers, which showed that, this kind of comprador government, the Palestinian Authority, was willing to make the most glaring concessions. All of Jerusalem, the tiniest borders for a sovereign Palestinian state, having no military, all of these things that the politicians in Israel say are necessary for peace was on the table. Every possible concession, except the concession of leaving all of Palestine altogether, was on the table by the PA and was rejected by the state of Israel. And this revelation dispels this mantra by the Israeli government that we want peace, we just can't find a partner for peace. Well, Israel doesn't want peace. Israel wants land. They want all the land. And they don't care who is living on that land. But I think that the true policies and the true attitudes of the Israeli government towards the Palestinian people was laid bare to the world during Operation Cast Lead, during the massacre December 08 and January 09. Now, I traveled to Gaza just months after the massacre took place. I saw the complete destruction of every single part of the city that I saw. Not a single building was without holes, and shrapnel was not destroyed. Meeting with people who had been wounded, and just looking at this operation, look at what was targeted in Gaza. Now, this is the results of actually UN fact-finding missions led by a Zionist named Richard Goldstone. That the Israeli government targeted schools while schools were in session, children's schools, children young as 7 years old, while they're in their classrooms, were attacked with white phosphorus. Israeli intelligence is very good. They know when school is in session. They know where those bombs are falling. They targeted homes. They targeted hospitals. They targeted markets where people were shopping. They even targeted UN bomb shelters, civilian bomb shelters, and destroyed them. So if you were packed into a city, the most densely populated city on the planet, not allowed to leave, and one of the most powerful militaries on the planet is targeting homes and schools and hospitals and bomb shelters and markets, where are you supposed to go? And the answer was there was nowhere for anyone to go. I met men who were wounded in their homes and brought to a hospital and wounded again when the hospital was bombed. And, it's one thing to kind of know of the atrocities that took place. Many of us saw the pictures, but to actually see the faces of those people who had been through such a horror, the children who had lost their legs, the people who had been paralyzed, who had had their faces burned off, was, of course, an extremely difficult experience. But what we learned from that experience, and when we asked all of these people, we were bringing aid, medical aid, into Gaza. When we asked, what do you need most? And this is Gaza, where no building supplies are allowed in to rebuild the buildings, where the majority of people live in grinding poverty, food insecurity, where everyone is malnourished, where they don't have basic medical supplies. When they asked what they wanted most, they said, we want you. We want to see you. We want to see your faces. We want solidarity. They see the demonstrations here. They learn about actions like this here. And while the Palestinian people will continue to resist, because, of course, if they did not, they would not exist as a people, we must know here that every action we carry out in solidarity with them has a resounding impact among the people who are living under the bombs. And I'll close with just a brief story, kind of another element of my experience in Gaza. And, this, of course, is one that, I hope those who are here in support of the state of Israel, it'd be interesting to hear their response to this type of thing. But when we were bringing in medical aid to Gaza, the number one thing that we were bringing in was wheelchairs, was hundreds and hundreds of wheelchairs, cargo trucks filled to the brim with wheelchairs. And the reason that we were having to smuggle in and break the blockade to bring in wheelchairs is because there is such a high degree of amputations from the white phosphorus used in violation of international law on civilian populations, from these most high-tech bombs that were tested on the Palestinian people, using them as guinea pigs, these bombs that were concocted in US laboratories by these multi-billion-dollar defense contractors and then tested on a civilian population. There was such a high degree of amputations that there were not enough wheelchairs for the children and the elderly who had been maimed. And not only that, but the blockade, the Israeli siege, blocking anything from getting in, and what once was continued on the Egyptian side as well, they would not allow in wheelchairs for 5-year-olds who had had their legs blown off by a US bomb. And this is not a mistake. This is not because they think the wheelchairs will be turned into bombs. It is part of a strategy to crush the will of the people and to use what nobody else could argue calling terrorism against an innocent population who did nothing more than try to live. Now, I would like to say that things are rapidly changing, that the recent February UN Security Council vote on the illegal settlements, they were voted against 14-1. I mean, this is the established international community, the leaders of the world, most of which are very, very bad. But the United States was the sole defender of these illegal settlements. And what we've just witnessed was this, or witnessing currently, was this wave of Arab revolts in this region of the world that's lived so long under the shackles of colonialism. And now, this should be very encouraging for us here in the United States. And hopefully no one here is disheartened by some Zionists who have shown up here today. Because, I mean, first of all, I mean, our group here is very young, very diverse, people of all walks of life, and there's a very specific